Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. Some evenings don't feel heavy because of what happened during the day. They feel heavy because of how you spoke to yourself while it was happening. Not out loud, just quietly in ways no one else could hear. Jasmine had gotten used to that voice. She was 34, worked as a real estate agent, and spent most of her days smiling, reassuring, adjusting her tone depending on who stood in front of her. Confidence was part of the job. Calm, too. People wanted to feel safe when they talked about homes, money, futures. Jasmine knew how to give them that feeling. What she rarely gave herself was the same kindness. That night she came home later than planned. Not late enough to be a problem, just late enough to feel the day lingering in her body. She slipped off her shoes, dropped her keys in the bowl by the door, and went straight to the bathroom without turning on the overhead lights. The small lamp above the mirror was enough. She turned on the faucet and washed her hands slowly, watching the water move over her skin. Clear, steady, predictable. The fan hummed softly above her, filling the room with a low, even sound. Jasmine looked up at the mirror without really meaning to. Her reflection stared back familiar and slightly tired. Nothing wrong with it. Nothing remarkable either. Just a face at the end of a long day. And then the voice showed up. You should have handled that call better. You sounded unsure. You probably came off as unprepared. The thoughts arrived the way they always did, quick, automatic, dressed up as helpful feedback. Jasmine didn't flinch. She had heard them so many times they felt like part of the background. She reached for a towel and dried her hands, her eyes still on the mirror. For a moment, she noticed something small. The tighter her thoughts became, the harder her face looked. Jaw set, brow slightly furrowed, shoulders rising without permission. She exhaled without planning to. The face in the mirror softened just a little. Jasmine leaned closer and rested her hands on the edge of the sink. The glass reflected her exactly as she was. Not worse, not better, just accurate. She thought about how often she treated herself like a project that needed constant improvement. How every interaction became something to review, every silence something to interpret. The world in her mind felt sharp because her inner lens was sharp. The mirror didn't argue. It didn't reassure her either. It simply showed what was placed in front of it. Water continued to run in the sink. Jasmine turned it off and listened to the last drops fade away. The quiet felt wider now, like the room had exhaled with her. She remembered something she once heard, though she couldn't recall where. A lake reflects whatever stands before it. It doesn't decide what's worthy of being seen. That idea stayed with her as she studied her own reflection. Maybe the world hadn't been harsh today. Maybe it had simply been reflecting the way she was looking at herself. That thought didn't accuse her. It didn't blame her. It just hovered, offering space. Jasmine straightened and gently wiped a small smudge from the mirror with her sleeve. The glass cleared only slightly, but enough to notice the difference. The reflection didn't change much, but the effort felt kind. She turned off the bathroom light and walked into the bedroom, leaving the mirror behind. The apartment was quiet. Streetlights cast soft lines across the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her shoulders drop forward, then back. For the first time that evening, she didn't replay the day. She didn't rewrite conversations. She didn't correct herself. She simply sat. If the world felt harsh sometimes, Jasmine realized it might not be because it was judging her. It might be because she was standing in front of it with clenched hands and a tight heart. And just like the mirror, the world could only reflect what it was given. She lay down slowly, the mattress meeting her weight without resistance. Her breathing deepened on its own. Somewhere inside, the voice grew quieter, not because it was silenced, but because it wasn't being fed. The lake doesn't need to change the sky. It only needs stillness to reflect it clearly. Jasmine closed her eyes, letting that thought settle without turning it into a rule or a promise. Just a gentle understanding, allowed to be unfinished. Jasmine lay still for a while, long enough for the room to lose its edges. The streetlights outside didn't move, but their glow softened as her eyes adjusted. Somewhere below, a car passed and then faded, leaving the night intact again. Nothing called for her attention. Nothing needed a response. Her body began to settle in small, quiet ways. Her jaw loosened first, then her shoulders. The tight place between her ribs softened, as if it had finally been given permission to stop holding itself together. She thought again about the mirror, about how easily she had believed the reflection was the problem. For so long she had assumed that if the image felt harsh, then something about her must be harsh too. But mirrors don't judge. They don't criticize. They don't exaggerate. They only show what's placed in front of them exactly as it is. The same was true, she realized, for so many moments in her life. Conversations that felt cold, silences that felt heavy, rejections that felt personal. What if they weren't proof of something wrong with her, but reflections of how tightly she was holding herself while standing there? The thought didn't land as a revelation. It felt more like a quiet reframing, the kind that doesn't ask you to change immediately, just to notice. Jasmine turned onto her side and pulled the blanket up a little higher. The fabric brushed against her cheek, grounding familiar. Her breathing slowed further, deep and uncounted. Thoughts still came, but they moved like ripples now instead of waves. A showing that didn't turn into an argument. A message she hadn't answered yet. A feeling of mild regret that didn't demand punishment. She noticed how different it felt to meet those thoughts without sharpening them, without turning them into evidence, without adding a second layer of judgment on top. In the bathroom earlier, when she had softened her face, the reflection had softened too. Not because the mirror changed, but because she did. That small act of gentleness had altered the entire scene. Maybe self-worth wasn't something you built or earned. Maybe it was something that appeared naturally when you stopped attacking your own reflection. Jasmine didn't promise herself she would be kinder from now on. She knew better than to make vows at night, but she allowed the possibility that tomorrow didn't need to begin with criticism. That the day could be met with open hands instead of clenched ones. Her breath moved slowly in and out, steady as water settling after being stirred. The image of a lake came to her mind, calm and wide. When the surface is agitated, everything looks distorted. When it rests, the sky shows itself without effort. She didn't need to fix the lake. She only needed to stop throwing stones into it. The thought drifted through her and dissolved before it could turn into advice. Jasmine stayed with the feeling instead. The quiet relief of not having to manage herself for a moment. The safety of not being evaluated. Outside, the city continued to exist without her supervision. Lights stayed on, lights turned off. People slept, people woke. The world didn't require her commentary to keep moving. Jasmine felt herself getting heavier in the good way. The kind of heaviness that comes before sleep when the body trusts the surface beneath it. Her eyelids grew warm. The space behind her eyes darkened. If the world reflected how she treated herself, then this moment mattered. Not as a lesson, not as a breakthrough, but as practice. A brief experience of being met with softness instead of scrutiny. She let her thoughts blur at the edges, let the day slide out of focus. There would be time later to look again if needed. Tonight wasn't for that. The lake doesn't hold on to images. It reflects and then it rests. Jasmine rested too. Jason turned off the engine and stayed in the car. The parking lot was almost empty. A few lights buzzed overhead, throwing pale circles onto the asphalt. Somewhere nearby, a tree moved in the wind, its leaves brushing against each other in a slow, uneven rhythm. He should have gone inside. His apartment was only a short walk away. But he stayed where he was, hands resting on the steering wheel, shoulders slightly hunched forward as if he were still bracing for something. Jason was 23, a community college student still figuring out what he was supposed to become. Lately, it felt like everyone else had already decided. Friends posting graduation photos, new jobs, new cities, new lives that looked clean and confident from the outside. He hadn't failed. Not exactly. But he hadn't arrived anywhere either. Jason glanced at his phone on the passenger seat face down. He already knew what was there. Notifications he didn't want to open. Photos he didn't want to compare himself to. Timelines that made his own life feel stalled. He looked away and focused instead on the tree near the edge of the lot. It was old, thick trunk, wide branches reaching out in every direction. The kind of tree that didn't look like it had ever been in a hurry. Its roots must have been deep by now, spreading out beneath the concrete in ways no one could see. Jason watched it sway slightly in the breeze and felt something tighten in his chest. Earlier that day, he'd been in a small garden section of a hardware store, killing time before class. He hadn't meant to stop there. He just wandered in, drawn by the quiet. On a low shelf near the back, he'd noticed a row of bonsai trees, each one carefully shaped, trimmed, wired into a precise form. They were beautiful, controlled, finished. He remembered thinking how neat they looked, how intentional, how impressive it must be to grow something so perfectly contained. Now sitting in his car, he thought about the difference between those bonsai trees and the old one in front of him. Both alive, both real, but grown under very different conditions. Jason rested his forehead lightly against the steering wheel. The car was still warm from the drive. The faint smell of plastic and dust filled the space. He'd spent the last year feeling like a bonsai in the wrong pot, trimmed too often, compared too closely, constantly adjusted to fit a shape he wasn't even sure he wanted. Every time he thought about taking a different path, a quieter voice in his head would pull him back. "You're falling behind. You should be further along by now." That voice sounded practical, reasonable. It rarely yelled. It just kept pointing out how much taller other people seemed. Jason straightened up and rolled his shoulders, trying to release some of the tension that had been building there all evening. His breath came shallow at first, then slowly deepened as he sat there longer. The old tree outside didn't care how tall it looked compared to anything else. It wasn't measured against a timeline. It didn't apologize for growing slowly or unevenly. It simply took up the space it had been given year after year. Jason realized how often he'd assumed there was a single right shape for a life. Graduate by this age. Earn this much. Know this clearly who you are. Anything outside that shape felt like a mistake. But what if some lives weren't meant to be trimmed small and tidy? What if some needed time, space, messy seasons where nothing looked impressive from the outside? He opened the car door and stepped out. The air felt cooler, immediately brushing against his face and arms. He walked a few steps toward the tree, stopping at the edge of the parking lot. Up close, the bark was rough, uneven. Scars from years of weather insects, repairs the tree had done on its own. Jason reached out and rested his palm against the trunk. It felt solid, grounded, alive. The tree hadn't grown like this by accident. It had grown like this because it had been allowed to. Jason closed his eyes for a moment and let himself breathe. Not deeply on purpose, just enough to feel the air move in and out of his chest without resistance. Maybe he wasn't late. Maybe he wasn't behind. Maybe he was just not meant to grow in a shallow container. The thought didn't solve anything. It didn't give him a plan. But it loosened something inside him, the way loosening a tight knot doesn't fix the rope but makes it usable again. Jason stepped back, gave the tree one last look, and headed toward his apartment. The night felt quieter now, less judgmental. Not because his life had changed, but because the way he was measuring it had softened. Some things aren't small because they're weak. Some things are small because someone keeps cutting them back, and some things, given enough room, grow exactly as they're meant to. Jason didn't turn on the lights when he entered the apartment. The faint glow from the parking lot slipped in through the window, enough to see the outlines of furniture, enough to move without effort. He set his keys down on the counter and left his shoes by the door, not lining them up the way he usually did. Tonight didn't feel like a night for adjustments. He sat on the edge of the couch and let his back curve forward naturally, elbows resting on his thighs. His phone stayed in his pocket. For once, he didn't feel pulled toward it. The comparisons it held felt distant now, like something that belonged to another room. The image of the old tree stayed with him, not as a lesson, not as an idea to apply, but as a feeling in his body. The weight of the trunk, the steadiness, the sense of time moving slowly, without apology. Jason noticed how often his life had felt like it was being shaped from the outside. Grades, expectations, advice offered with good intentions, all of it trimming, wiring, redirecting. None of it meant to harm him, and yet something in him had been quietly resisting for a long time. He leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. A small crack ran across it, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. He had lived here for months before ever seeing it. Now it seemed almost comforting proof that things didn't need to be flawless to hold. The old tree outside hadn't asked to be admired. It hadn't worried about being impressive. It had grown because it was alive, because the ground beneath it was deep enough, because no one had tried to make it smaller to fit a shelf. Jason felt his breathing slow as that thought settled. Not intentionally, not as a technique, just a natural response to not being measured for a moment. He thought about the bonsai trees again, how much care they required, how carefully they were pruned, shaped, constrained. They weren't wrong. They were beautiful in their own way. But they needed constant attention to remain that way. Maybe some lives thrived on structure and careful shaping, and maybe others needed seasons of uneven growth stretches where nothing looked tidy or finished. Maybe comparing one to the other had never made sense in the first place. Jason shifted his weight and felt the couch cushion rise and fall beneath him. The room was quiet enough that he could hear his own breath, steady and unforced. The tension he'd been carrying in his chest earlier had softened like a muscle finally allowed to rest. He didn't feel proud. He didn't feel resolved. What he felt was simpler than that. He felt allowed. Allowed to grow slowly. Allowed to change direction. Allowed not to know yet. The pressure to arrive somewhere specific eased its grip. Not gone, just quieter, less convincing. It no longer sounded like truth, more like a habit losing momentum. Jason stood up and walked to the window, looking out toward the parking lot. The tree was still there, barely visible now, its shape blending into the dark. He didn't need to see it clearly to know it was standing. Some growth happens where no one is watching. Some strength comes from being left alone. He turned away from the window and moved toward the bedroom. The floor was cool under his feet. The bed welcomed him without resistance, sheets folding easily around his weight. He lay on his side and let his arms rest where they fell. There was nothing he needed to plan tonight, nothing he needed to compare. Tomorrow could handle itself. As his eyes grew heavy, Jason noticed one last thing. The feeling of being behind had been replaced by something quieter. A sense of being exactly where he was without judgment attached. Not small, not late, just growing in his own way. The old tree didn't rush the night, and neither did he. The room settled. The thoughts thinned. The measuring stopped. And in the dark, with no one watching, something inside him continued to grow slowly, naturally, without needing to prove itself at all. The garage smelled like oil and old metal, the kind of smell that never really leaves, no matter how many times you clean. Derek liked that about it. It felt honest. Nothing pretending to be new. He stood near the workbench with his sleeves rolled up, hands dark with grease. The overhead light casting a dull yellow circle onto the concrete floor. The shop was closed for the night. No engines running, no radios playing, just the quiet hum of the light and the faint ticking sound of cooling metal. Derek was 52, a mechanic most of his life. The kind who could listen to an engine for 10 seconds and know where the problem lived. People trusted him with their cars, with their safety. They didn't know how often he questioned himself when the garage door rolled down at the end of the day. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands slowly, not trying to get them perfectly clean. Some stains stayed no matter what you did. He'd learned not to fight that. Earlier that afternoon, a customer had made an offhand comment. Nothing cruel, just careless. Something about getting older, about how long guys like you keep doing this kind of work. Derek had laughed it off. He always did. But the words had followed him into the evening, settling somewhere behind his ribs. He leaned his hip against the bench and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The garage felt different at night, less demanding, more forgiving. During the day, everything was about fixing, adjusting, restoring things to how they were supposed to be. At night, nothing asked to be repaired. Derek's eyes drifted to a block of stone sitting in the corner, half covered with a tarp. It had been there for months, a leftover from a project he never finished. He hadn't planned on keeping it. It just stayed. He walked over and pulled the tarp back. The stone was rough, uneven edges chipped. To anyone else, it probably looked like a mistake. A failed start. Something abandoned halfway through. Derek ran his hand over the surface. Cool, solid, unapologetic. Years ago, when his kids were still young, he'd taken them to a museum on a rare day off. He remembered standing in front of a sculpture, massive and calm, carved from a single block of stone. One of his kids had asked how the artist knew what it would look like before starting. The guide had smiled and said the sculpture was already there. The artist just removed what didn't belong. That line had stayed with Derek longer than he expected. At the time, he'd thought it sounded poetic. Now, standing alone in his garage, it felt uncomfortably personal. Derek thought about his own life, the things that had chipped away at him over the years, long hours, missed moments, mistakes he replayed more often than he admitted, words he wished he'd said differently, paths he hadn't taken because responsibility had come first. Sometimes it felt like life had taken a hammer to him without asking, like he'd been worn down instead of shaped. He rested his forehead briefly against the cool stone and closed his eyes. Not in defeat, just in acknowledgement. What if the years hadn't been punishing him? What if they had been revealing him? The thought didn't land easily. It pushed against something tight in his chest. Derek wasn't used to being gentle with himself. He respected effort, endurance, getting through. But gentleness had always felt like something you earned later, if at all. He stepped back and looked at the stone again, this time with different eyes. It wasn't unfinished. It was becoming. The marks on its surface told a story of pressure resistance time. None of that made it worthless. None of it meant it had failed. Derek wiped his hands again and hung the rag on a hook by the door. He turned off the overhead light, leaving only a small lamp on near the bench. The garage slipped into shadow edges, softening expectations, fading with the brightness. He sat down on an old stool and let his shoulders drop forward. The day drained out of him slowly, like oil settling after an engine shuts down. His breathing deepened without instruction. So much of his regret came from believing he should look different by now, more polished, more certain, less marked by wear. But stone doesn't apologize for its marks. It carries them as proof of process. Derek stayed there, surrounded by quiet, letting that idea exist without trying to turn it into wisdom. Just a possibility. A softer way to see the same life. The stone waited patiently in the corner, unchanged, unbothered by the hour. And for the first time in a long while, Derek didn't feel the need to fix what he was seeing. Derek stayed on the stool longer than he expected. The small lamp cast a low amber light across the garage, turning sharp edges into softer shapes. The stone in the corner no longer looked heavy. It simply looked present, as if it had always belonged there. He noticed how different the space felt when nothing needed to be repaired. During the day, every sound in the garage meant something was wrong. At night, the quiet meant things were allowed to rest exactly as they were. Derek leaned back slightly and let his hands rest on his thighs. The grease under his nails no longer bothered him. It felt like evidence, not dirt. Proof of a life spent working, showing up, doing what needed to be done, even when it wasn't glamorous. For years, he had carried the belief that wear meant decline. That every mark on his body, every line on his face, every regret in his memory was a sign that something had gone off course. But the stone didn't see it that way. It had been shaped by pressure, not ruined by it. The thought settled in him slowly, without resistance. He didn't need to rewrite his past. He didn't need to forgive himself all at once. He only needed to stop treating his own history like a failure. Derek stood up and walked back to the stone, placing both hands on its surface again. He didn't imagine a finished form inside it. He didn't plan a next step. He simply felt the cool weight beneath his palms and let that be enough. Life, he realized, wasn't a process of becoming someone else. It was a process of uncovering what had been there from the beginning, beneath expectations, mistakes, and years of trying to be useful. He covered the stone again with the tarp, not to hide it, but to let it wait. Some things didn't need to be rushed into completion. Some things were allowed to remain unfinished for a while longer. Derek turned off the lamp and closed the garage door behind him. The click of the lock echoed briefly, then disappeared into the night. Outside, the air felt cooler, cleaner. The street was quiet the way it gets when most people have gone to bed. As he walked toward the house, his steps felt heavier in a good way, grounded. The ache in his back didn't vanish, but it didn't feel like an enemy either. It was simply part of the body that had carried him this far. Inside, he washed his hands at the sink, watching the water darken and then clear again. He didn't scrub hard. He let the oil lift gradually, leaving faint traces behind. Not everything had to be erased. He turned off the kitchen light and made his way to the bedroom, letting the house stay dim. The bed welcomed him without ceremony. He lay down and let his arms fall where they did, chest rising and falling with a steady rhythm. The image of the stone returned once more, not as a metaphor, but as a feeling. Solid, patient, shaped by time, not broken by it. Derek felt his thoughts slow, then thin. The regrets that usually circled at night didn't find much to hold on to. There was nothing to fix right now, nothing to prove, nothing to correct. Somewhere between one breath and the next, a quiet understanding settled in. Life hadn't been trying to destroy him. It had been working with what was there, removing what didn't belong, revealing what did. The sculptor doesn't create the stone. He listens to it. Derek listened now to his own body, to the quiet of the house, to the simple fact of being here. The day loosened its grip. The years softened around the edges. And in the dark, with no tools in his hands and no expectations pressing in, he allowed himself to rest as he was already shaped, already enough still becoming. The train rocked gently as it pulled away from the platform, a low metallic rhythm, settling in beneath everything else. Priya stood near the door, at first holding the pole with one hand, her bag resting against her hip. The car wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. People were spaced out in their own small bubbles. Eyes down, headphones on each body, moving with the shared motion of the ride. She found an open seat by the window and sat tucking her feet slightly under the bench. Outside, the city slid past in layers, brick, glass, concrete, then a blur of lights as the train picked up speed. The motion was familiar enough to be comforting, but not enough to feel like home. Priya was 28 and worked as a data analyst for a company she liked well enough. The work made sense to her. Patterns, numbers, quiet focus. It was the rest of life that often felt harder to place. Conversations that moved too fast. Rooms where everyone else seemed to know where they belonged. Decisions that felt heavier than they looked on paper. She rested her forehead briefly against the cool window glass and watched her reflection drift in and out over the darkening city. It always surprised her how clearly she could feel present and out of place at the same time, like she was there doing everything required but slightly off-center, as if she'd arrived without the final instruction. The train slowed near the next stop, brakes sighing softly. A few people stood to leave. Others took their seats. The space adjusted around her without asking. Earlier that day, Priya had been in a meeting where everyone spoke easily, tossing ideas back and forth like they were all holding the same map. She had followed along, contributed when needed, nodded at the right moments. No one excluded her. No one questioned her place. And still, when the meeting ended, she'd felt the familiar tug of doubt. A quiet sense that she was filling a seat that belonged to someone else, that eventually someone would notice the mismatch. She pulled her jacket closer around herself, not because she was cold, but because the pressure felt grounding. The train swayed again, steady and predictable, as if reminding everyone inside that they were being carried whether they tried to control it or not. Priya thought about a puzzle she'd worked on as a kid, one of those with hundreds of pieces scattered across the table. She remembered the feeling of scanning the shapes, convinced there had to be one missing. She'd checked the box, the floor under the couch. Only later did she realize the piece had been there the whole time, just turned the wrong way. That memory surfaced now without effort as the train moved her through tunnels and open air. She wondered how many times she'd treated herself like a missing piece when she was simply not yet oriented. The train emerged above ground lights spilling in through the windows. Buildings gave way to trees for a few moments, their branches streaking past. The rhythm of the ride smoothed her breathing without her noticing. In and out. Slow, uncounted breaths. Priya watched the people across from her. A woman scrolling through her phone. A man staring at the floor, jaw relaxed. Someone humming quietly beneath their breath. None of them seemed to be proving anything. None of them looked like they were trying to justify their presence on the train. They were just here. She felt a soft ache behind her ribs, the kind that came from wanting to belong without knowing where to place that want. For years, she'd believed belonging was something you earned by fitting in just right, saying the right things, choosing the right path, becoming a version of yourself that made sense to everyone else. But the train didn't ask for that. It didn't care who deserved a seat. It simply moved, carrying every passenger equally regardless of their stories. Priya shifted slightly and let her shoulders drop. The tension there eased just a fraction. She didn't feel suddenly included. She didn't feel whole in a dramatic way. What she felt was quieter. She felt less separate. The train slowed again, pulling into another station. Doors opened. Air rushed in. A few passengers stepped out. Others stepped in. The shape of the car changed, but the ride continued. Priya realized then how often she'd imagined herself as an extra piece, one that didn't quite fit anywhere. But nothing here felt like extra. The train had room. The bench had room. The moment had room. She rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. The window reflected her face again, softer now, less questioned. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to solve herself before the next stop. Maybe she wasn't missing. Maybe she was already part of the picture, even if she couldn't see the full image yet. The thought stayed with her as the train carried her forward, steady and patient, into whatever came next. The train continued on, carrying Priya through neighborhoods she recognized and others she only knew by name. The movement was steady now, familiar enough that her body no longer braced for it. She rested back against the seat and let the window support the side of her head, watching lights pass in long, gentle streaks. She noticed how her thoughts had slowed. Not disappeared, just softened around the edges. They no longer lined up to argue her place in the world. They floated in and out like reflections on the glass, present but not demanding. For most of her life, Priya had believed belonging was something external, a place you arrived at, a group that opened itself to you. A moment when everything finally clicked and you could say, "This is where I fit." Until then, she assumed she was incomplete, waiting for the missing piece that would make the picture whole. But sitting on the train surrounded by strangers who were not really strangers at all, she felt something shift. No one here knew her story. No one needed to. And still she was carried just the same. The idea settled quietly. Maybe belonging wasn't about fitting perfectly into a shape. Maybe it was about being held, even temporarily, by the same movement, the same moment, the same direction. The train dipped back underground, the windows turning into mirrors again. Priya caught her reflection and studied it without judgment. The face looking back didn't appear unfinished. It looked attentive, alive, in motion. She thought again about that childhood puzzle, about how the piece she'd been searching for had never been gone, only turned the wrong way. How easy it was to mistake orientation for absence. How often she'd done the same with herself. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She didn't reach for it. Whatever it was could wait. Right now, there was nothing she needed to confirm. The train slowed, then picked up speed again. The sound of wheels against rails created a low, even rhythm, almost like breathing. Priya matched her breath to it without trying. In, out, carried forward. She felt the familiar urge to evaluate herself begin to fade. Not because she had answered all her questions, but because the questions no longer felt urgent. There would be time for them later, if they mattered at all. When the announcement for her stop played, she didn't feel the usual jolt of uncertainty. She stood, moved toward the door, and stepped off with the others. The platform was cool and quiet, the air heavier than inside the car. The train doors closed behind her, and with a soft, mechanical sigh, it continued on without pause. Priya watched it disappear into the tunnel lights, shrinking until there was only darkness again. She felt a small pang then, not of loss, but of recognition. The train hadn't left her behind. It had simply completed its role. She walked up the stairs and out into the night. The street above was calm, washed in yellow light. A few people passed by, each absorbed in their own direction. No one questioned her presence. No one measured her pace. As she walked home, Priya realized something else. She had spent years trying to locate the place where she would finally belong, as if it were fixed and waiting. But belonging wasn't stationary. It moved. It shifted. It appeared wherever she allowed herself to be fully present without shrinking. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, setting her bag down gently. The apartment greeted her with familiar silence. She didn't rush to fill it. She let it stay quiet. Priya sat on the edge of the couch for a moment, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her body felt heavier now, in the way it does when it trusts the ground beneath it. The day loosened its grip. The doubts that usually followed her into the evening didn't seem to know where to land. She didn't suddenly feel complete in a dramatic sense, but she no longer felt like a piece waiting to be found. She lay down and let her breath settle. The image of the puzzle faded, replaced by something simpler. A sense of being part of a larger movement, even without seeing the whole picture. Nothing needed to click into place tonight. Nothing needed to be resolved. Priya closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest inside the truth that had been there all along. She had never been missing. She had always been part of the whole. The hotel room was quiet in the particular way only hotel rooms are. Not truly silent, but padded. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a low, even sound that felt like it was holding the room together. Ava lay on the bed with one arm draped over her stomach, the other resting along her side, still in her work clothes, shoes kicked off near the door where they had landed. She had arrived less than an hour ago, but the sense of dislocation had already settled in. Different city, same carpet, same heavy curtains, same faint smell of detergent and recycled air. Ava had learned to recognize that feeling early in her career, the sense of being everywhere and nowhere at once. She was 29 and worked as a flight attendant. From the outside, it sounded glamorous. Travel, movement, a life that didn't sit still long enough to get boring. People often said they were jealous. Ava smiled when they did. It was easier than explaining the parts that didn't show up in photos. Tonight's flight had been smooth. Short conversations, polite passengers, nothing memorable. And yet, as soon as she closed the hotel door behind her, the quiet had pressed in heavier than expected. Ava rolled onto her side and stared at the thin strip of light leaking around the curtain. Somewhere beyond it, a city she barely knew was going about its evening. People meeting friends, people going home, people sleeping in beds that didn't change every few nights. She reached for the remote and turned the TV on, then off again almost immediately. The voices felt too close, too awake. She preferred the steady sound of the air conditioner, constant and indifferent. Ava pushed herself up and sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on her thighs. She bent forward slightly, letting her head hang for a moment, long enough to feel the blood shift, long enough for the day to slide out of focus. She'd been good at moving for as long as she could remember. Good at adapting, good at smiling, and being pleasant in short bursts. But nights like this always brought the same question quietly, without accusation. Where do I actually belong? Not in a dramatic way. She wasn't lonely exactly. She had friends. She had a job she liked well enough. But sometimes, especially in hotel rooms that all looked the same, she felt like a small point of light drifting between places, never landing long enough to be named. Ava stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see out. The city below was a scatter of lights, uneven and distant. Cars moved along dark lines of road. A few buildings glowed brighter than others. No single light stood out for long. She leaned her forehead lightly against the glass and exhaled. Earlier that day, during a layover, she'd overheard a passenger talking about stars, about how some were so far away that the light reaching us now had started its journey millions of years ago. Some of those stars don't even exist anymore, the passenger had said casually, but we still see them. That idea had stayed with her. Ava looked at the lights below and thought about how often she felt small in comparison to everything else. How easy it was to believe that if she wasn't central, she must be insignificant. That if no one was looking directly at her, she might as well not be there at all. She pulled the curtain back into place and returned to the bed, sitting cross-legged, now hands resting loosely in her lap. The air conditioner clicked softly as it adjusted, then returned to its steady hum. Ava closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to pause. She noticed how her body felt when it wasn't bracing for the next announcement, the next boarding call, the next smile. There was a faint ache in her shoulders, a tiredness behind her eyes, and beneath that, something gentler, a quiet persistence. She thought about stars again, about how many of them we never notice. Not because they aren't shining, but because the sky is vast and our attention is limited. A star doesn't stop being a star just because it isn't named or pointed at. That thought didn't make her feel special. It made her feel allowed to be small without being meaningless, allowed to be quiet without disappearing. Ava lay back and stared at the ceiling. The room felt less foreign now, its edges softening as her breathing slowed. The air conditioner continued its steady work, filling the space with something predictable. She didn't need to decide where she belonged tonight. She didn't need to anchor herself to one place to be real. She could exist exactly as she was moving, passing through, leaving small traces of light behind her without tracking where they landed. Some stars don't guide ships. Some don't carry names. They still shine. Ava felt her eyelids grow heavy as that idea settled in her body, not as a belief to hold on to, but as a quiet truth she didn't need to defend. The room held her gently anonymous and safe as the night deepened around the window. Ava lay still as the room continued its quiet work around her. The air conditioner hummed without change, steady and unconcerned. Outside, the city lights shifted slightly as clouds moved through the sky, softening some points of brightness while allowing others to come through more clearly. She rested one hand on her stomach and felt the gentle rise and fall of her breath. Each inhale arrived on its own. Each exhale left without being held. Her body knew how to do this part without instruction. For a long time, Ava had believed that being visible meant being valuable. That if her presence didn't register strongly, if it didn't leave an impression, it must not have mattered. That belief had followed her from place to place, quietly shaping how she saw herself during layovers, conversations, even moments of rest. But stars don't measure their worth by how many eyes find them. They don't dim themselves when no one is looking. They don't rush to become brighter than the sky around them. The thought settled in her slowly, like light spreading after dusk. Ava didn't feel grand or important. she felt relieved, as if she had been released from a task she didn't remember agreeing to. She shifted slightly, pulling the blanket up and letting the weight of it ground her. The bed held her without preference. The room didn't ask for her story. It didn't need her to be interesting. Ava thought about the places she'd passed through over the years, airports that blurred together, hotel rooms she could barely distinguish from one another, faces she remembered without names. All those moments had felt temporary, almost disposable, as if they didn't count because they didn't last. But nothing about a star's light is wasted. Even the faintest glow travels far beyond its origin, touching things it will never see. That idea softened something deep in her chest. Maybe her life didn't need a single fixed center to be meaningful. Maybe meaning could move with her, appearing wherever she was willing to be present, even briefly. She closed her eyes and let the darkness behind her eyelids deepen. The city outside continued without her participation. Cars moved, elevators rose and fell. Somewhere a door opened and closed. The room stayed steady. Ava noticed how much quieter her mind had become. The questions about belonging didn't feel urgent anymore. They could wait. They always could. She remembered standing at windows like this before in other cities, other nights, feeling the same smallness and mistaking it for emptiness. Tonight, that smallness felt different. It felt like space, not empty, open. The air conditioner clicked once, then resumed its hum. Ava's breathing matched it naturally, slow and even. The edges of her thoughts blurred, one dissolving into the next without resistance. She didn't need to shine in a particular way. She didn't need to be central. She didn't need to leave a mark she could track. Being here was enough. Shining quietly was enough. Some stars are seen, some are not. The sky makes room for all of them. Ava drifted toward sleep with that understanding resting gently in her body, the hotel room holding her like a temporary sky, neutral, quiet, and complete. Carla noticed the crack while she was washing dishes. It wasn't new. That was the strange part. The small ceramic bowl had been chipped for a long time, a thin line running from the rim down one side, like a quiet scar. She had used it dozens of times without really seeing it. Tonight, under the warm kitchen light, it caught her attention. She slowed her hands in the sink, letting the water run over the bowl. The crack darkened slightly as it filled, then lightened again as the water drained away. The sound of the faucet was steady, familiar, the kind of sound that made the rest of the house feel calmer. Carla was 48 and worked as a hairstylist. All day she stood behind people adjusting smoothing, making small corrections so others could leave feeling more put together than when they arrived. She was good at it. She had learned how to notice tiny details and fix them gently without drawing attention to the flaw. It rarely occurred to her to do the same for herself. She turned the bowl in her hands, studying the crack more closely now. It wasn't jagged. It didn't threaten to break apart. It simply existed, part of the bowl's shape, part of its history. Earlier that evening, a client had laughed and said, "You're so confident, I wish I was more like you." Carla had smiled and changed the subject the way she always did. Confidence felt like the wrong word. She felt capable, yes, reliable, but confident implied something unbroken, something smooth. Carla set the bowl in the drying rack and reached for a towel. As she dried her hands, her eyes drifted to the stack of mismatched dishes on the counter. None of them were perfect. Small chips, faded patterns, items collected over years rather than chosen all at once. She had always liked it that way. A kitchen that looked lived in. And yet, when it came to herself, she held a different standard. She noticed every crack, every place where she felt she should have healed faster, known better, been stronger by now. The faucet clicked off. The kitchen settled into a deeper quiet, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock above the fridge. Carla leaned her hip against the counter and let her shoulders relax forward. She thought about the word flawed, how easily it attached itself to people. How often she had described herself that way in her own head, as if a crack automatically meant something was damaged beyond use. Carla picked the bowl up again and held it at eye level. The light caught the glaze unevenly along the crack, creating a faint line of reflection. It wasn't ugly. If anything, it made the bowl more interesting, more honest. She remembered something she had read years ago about old pottery in Japan. How cracks were sometimes repaired with gold, not to hide the break, but to highlight it. The idea had stayed with her, even if she couldn't remember the name for it. The bowl in her hands hadn't been repaired with gold. No one had tried to make the crack beautiful. And still, it held water. It held food. It did exactly what it was meant to do. Carla felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the kind that came when she thought about her own past. Relationships that hadn't lasted. Choices she replayed late at night, the quiet belief that if she were less marked, life would have gone more smoothly. She set the bowl back down carefully and rested both palms on the counter. The surface was cool, solid, trustworthy. She took a slow breath and let it out without shaping it. What if being whole didn't mean being uncracked? What if it simply meant being able to hold what life placed inside you? The thought didn't demand an answer. It stayed there like the bowl on the counter, waiting to be noticed. Carla turned off the kitchen light and left the room dim, letting the glow from the living room spill in instead. The crack in the bowl was harder to see now, but she knew it was still there. And for the first time that evening, that didn't feel like a problem. Carla left the kitchen and moved into the living room, not turning on any more lights. The house felt different in the dimness, softer, less demanding. Shadows settled into corners without being asked to explain themselves. She sat down on the couch and let her back sink into the cushions, arms resting where they fell. The image of the bowl stayed with her, not as a symbol she needed to analyze, but as a quiet presence, something ordinary that had done its job without pretending to be untouched. She thought about how often she had treated her own life as if it were supposed to look unused. No visible wear, no chips, no signs that anything had ever pressed too hard. And when the marks showed up anyway, she'd taken them as evidence of failure instead of evidence of living. Carla crossed her legs and leaned her head back against the couch. The fabric was worn smooth in places, shaped by years of use. She liked that about it. It held her without trying to impress her. She remembered moments she usually avoided thinking about. Times she had trusted too much, stayed too long, left too early. None of them felt sharp tonight. They felt distant, like old weather that had already passed through. The bowl hadn't cracked because it was weak. It had cracked because it had been used, held heat, held weight, been part of countless small moments that mattered enough to leave a trace. Carla felt something ease in her chest as that understanding settled. She didn't need to repair herself to be acceptable. She didn't need to hide the places where life had pressed in. Those places didn't cancel her usefulness. They explained it. She stood up and walked back into the kitchen, drawn there without urgency. The bowl sat quietly in the drying rack, a thin line visible along its side. Carla lifted it again, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. It was steady, reliable. She filled it with water and carried it carefully to the sink. The bowl held the water without leaking, without protest. The crack didn't compromise its purpose. It simply told a story. Carla set the bowl down and turned off the remaining light. The kitchen faded into shadow, leaving only the faint outline of shapes she knew well. She didn't need to see everything clearly to trust it. In the bedroom, she changed into something soft and loose movements, slow, unhurried. The mirror caught her reflection briefly. She didn't look away. She didn't search for flaws. She just saw a woman who had been shaped by years of showing up. Carla lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, letting the weight settle across her shoulders. Her breathing slowed naturally, without direction. The day began to loosen its hold. She thought again of the pottery repaired with gold, the way cracks were honored instead of hidden. Not because suffering was beautiful, but because survival was honest. Maybe wholeness wasn't about returning to an unmarked state. Maybe it was about holding everything past present memory without falling apart. Carla felt her thoughts grow quieter, edges blurring. The crack no longer felt like something that needed attention. It simply existed, integrated, complete in its own way. The house rested around her, familiar and imperfect. The night moved forward without expectation. Somewhere the bowl waited in the kitchen, ready to be used again tomorrow. Carla closed her eyes, allowing herself to rest, without fixing, without correcting, without pretending to be unbroken. Nothing needed to be repaired tonight. Nothing needed to be hidden. She drifted toward sleep whole, not because she was flawless, but because she was still here, still holding still enough. Henry paused on the porch before sitting down, as if checking whether the night was settled enough to hold him. The wooden boards were cool beneath his bare feet. A porch swing hung slightly off-center, moving just a little in the breeze, its chain making a soft, familiar creak. Somewhere beyond the yard, crickets kept time without hurry. He lowered himself onto the swing and let it take his weight. The motion was gentle, almost accidental. Back and forth, back and forth. Not enough to call it rocking, just enough to feel carried. Henry was 58 and recently retired from the military. For most of his adult life, his days had been planned down to the minute. Wake times, briefings, objectives, even rest had been scheduled. Now, for the first time in decades, there was space. Long unmarked stretches of it. People had congratulated him, told him he'd earned this, asked what he was going to do next. Henry never quite knew how to answer. He had expected retirement to feel like relief, and sometimes it did. But more often, it felt like standing in shallow water, searching for something deeper without knowing where to swim. He wasn't unhappy. He just felt restless, as if peace were nearby but just out of reach. The swing creaked again as Henry shifted his weight. He rested his hands on his thighs and looked out at the dark yard. The grass moved slightly in the breeze, each blade responding in its own small way. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Earlier that evening, he had found himself pacing the house, moving from room to room without purpose. He'd opened the fridge, then closed it, picked up his phone, then set it back down. The habits of motion were still there, even when there was nothing left to complete. Henry had spent years believing happiness was something you arrived at, a point on the map, a reward at the end of enough effort. He had chased it in promotions, in achievements, in the quiet pride of being useful. And now that the chasing had stopped, the question lingered. Why doesn't it feel the way I thought it would? He leaned his head back against the porch post and let his eyes rest on the dark sky. Clouds moved slowly across it, thinning and thickening, revealing stars and then covering them again. Nothing dramatic, just steady change. Henry remembered a story someone had told him once long ago during a quiet watch. A simple story, almost a joke. A fish swimming from place to place, asking everyone it met where to find the ocean. The other fish looked at it strangely and said, "This is the ocean." And the fish replied, "No, this is water. I'm looking for the ocean." At the time, Henry had laughed and moved on. Tonight, the story returned with a different weight. He thought about how often he'd treated happiness the same way. Always just ahead, just beyond the next assignment, the next chapter, the next version of himself. He had been swimming in it, perhaps without ever noticing. The swing continued its quiet motion. Henry felt his breathing begin to match it. In, out. No effort required. His shoulders dropped slightly, a small release he hadn't asked for. He noticed how the night held everything without comment. The sounds, the dark, the slow movement of air. Nothing was trying to improve him. Nothing was asking him to be more than he was right now. Henry realized how deeply he had believed that peace required a different set of circumstances. Less noise, fewer questions, a clearer sense of direction. And yet sitting here, he couldn't point to anything missing. The porch light cast a warm circle around him, leaving the rest of the yard in shadow. The boundary felt kind, not limiting. Enough light to sit. Enough darkness to rest his eyes. He thought about all the times he had postponed contentment. After this tour, after this promotion, after I finally slowed down. Each time the finish line had moved a little further out. What if the ocean wasn't somewhere else? What if it was the very thing he had been moving through all along? The thought didn't feel exciting. It felt quiet, almost obvious. The kind of realization that doesn't change anything on the outside, but loosens something on the inside. Henry placed his feet flat on the porch and let the swing slow to a stop. The night didn't rush him. It didn't need him to arrive anywhere. He sat there breathing, listening, feeling the simple fact of being held by the moment. Not searching, not reaching, just floating. And for the first time since retiring, the restlessness eased, not because it had been answered, but because it no longer needed to be. Henry let the swing come to rest and stayed there anyway, as if the movement had simply shifted inward. The night felt settled now, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty, only complete. The crickets kept their rhythm. The air moved when it needed to, and then grew still again. He noticed how different his body felt when he stopped scanning for what was next. His chest wasn't tight anymore. His jaw rested easily. Even the small ache in his lower back felt neutral, like something that didn't need to be fixed right now. For most of his life, Henry had trusted effort, motion, progress. Those things had carried him far, and he didn't resent them, but sitting on the porch, surrounded by the simple sounds of the night, he realized effort had also trained him to overlook what didn't require earning. Peace, it turned out, didn't announce itself. It didn't arrive with a sense of accomplishment. It felt more like permission, the permission to stop swimming for a moment and notice the water already holding you. Henry rested his hands loosely on his thighs and closed his eyes. Not to think, just to feel. The weight of his body on the swing, the steady ground beneath the porch, the air entering his lungs and leaving again without being asked. The story of the fish returned softer this time. The fish hadn't been foolish. It had been sincere. It simply hadn't known how to recognize the ocean because it had never experienced anything else. The search had made sense until it didn't. Henry smiled faintly at that. He had been sincere too. He had done what he knew how to do. He had chased what he believed would finally feel like enough. And now, with nothing left to chase, he could see it more clearly. The ocean wasn't a destination. It was a condition. It was the space that allowed everything else to move. The quiet support underneath effort, underneath struggle, underneath even the search itself. It had been present during every assignment, every long night, every question about what came next. Henry hadn't missed it. He just hadn't needed to notice it before. The porch light hummed softly above him. A cloud slid across the stars, dimming them, and then letting them reappear. Nothing in the sky seemed concerned about being seen the whole time. He thought about the future briefly, about mornings without alarms, days without clear objectives. The thought didn't scare him the way it had before. It felt open, wide, like water. Henry stood and pushed the swing gently so it wouldn't creak anymore, then stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The house welcomed him with the familiar smell of wood and quiet. He didn't turn on any lights. He didn't need to see everything clearly. In the bedroom, he moved slowly, changing into something comfortable, each motion unhurried. When he lay down, the bed accepted his weight easily. His breathing deepened without instruction. The day loosened its grip and slid away. As sleep approached, Henry felt the last trace of searching fade. There was nowhere he needed to get to tonight. Nothing he needed to solve. He was already in it. He always had been. The ocean didn't require recognition to be vast. It simply held. And held by that understanding, Henry drifted into rest, no longer looking for happiness, but finally allowing himself to feel the water he had been swimming in all along. Some mornings don't arrive with energy. They arrive quietly, almost shy, like they're not sure if anyone is ready for them yet. Tyler was already awake when the light started to thin the darkness between the trees. He hadn't set an alarm. He rarely did on days like this. As a park ranger, his schedule shifted with the seasons, with weather, with things that didn't care much about clocks. That morning he stood on a narrow trail just before sunrise, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, breath visible for a moment and then gone. The forest was still. Not silent exactly, but waiting. The kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. Tyler took a few slow steps forward, boots pressing into damp soil. Somewhere above him, a bird began to sing. Just one. A thin, clear sound, unhurried, unafraid of being heard or not heard. It didn't repeat itself for effect. It didn't pause to see if anyone was listening. It simply sang the way it always did because that was what it did when the morning came. Tyler stopped walking. He hadn't meant to. His body just did it on its own. He stood there, head tilted slightly, listening. Another bird joined in, then another, each with its own rhythm, its own tone. None of them tried to match the others. None of them waited for permission. They weren't performing. They weren't proving anything. They weren't hoping for applause. They were just being birds. Tyler felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was tight. It wasn't a dramatic release, no wave of emotion, just a subtle shift, like when you unclench your jaw after holding it all night. Lately, he'd been carrying a quiet question around with him, one he didn't talk about much. It showed up when he scrolled through his phone at night, when he heard old friends talk about promotions or big moves or what's next. The question wasn't loud, but it was persistent. Am I doing enough? Enough on paper. His life was fine. Steady job, decent health, a small apartment close to the park. He liked his work. He believed in it. But sometimes, especially in moments of comparison, that didn't seem to count for much. The world was loud about success, about recognition, about being seen. And Tyler wasn't sure where someone like him fit into that noise. Another bird sang closer this time. Tyler smiled, almost without realizing it. Not because the sound was impressive, but because it was honest. The bird wasn't trying to be louder than the rest of the forest. It wasn't trying to stand out. It was simply responding to the morning. Tyler thought about how often he did the opposite. How often he checked to see if what he was doing mattered before he let himself enjoy it. How often he measured his days by reaction instead of by presence. How many times he'd waited for someone else to notice before he allowed himself to feel okay about where he was. The bird didn't wait. It sang again, the same simple phrase, as if nothing else in the world required its attention. Tyler leaned against a nearby tree, the bark cool through his jacket. He closed his eyes for a moment. The forest continued without him. The light shifted. The air moved. Nothing stopped just because he did. There was something oddly comforting about that. He realized that the birds weren't singing for the forest. They were singing from themselves, from whatever instinct or joy or necessity lived inside them. They didn't seem concerned with how their song landed. They didn't adjust their pitch to be more likable. They didn't question whether they deserved to be heard. They sang because singing was part of being alive. Tyler took a slow breath in, then out. The breath felt easier than it had earlier, like it didn't have to pass through as many tight places to get out. He thought about the small things he loved that no one ever clapped for. Early mornings like this, fixing trail signs, watching fog lift off the ground, listening to the woods wake up. None of it earned praise. None of it went online. But it filled something real in him. Maybe value didn't have to be loud. Maybe it didn't have to be proven. Maybe it didn't even have to be witnessed. Another song rose from the trees, then faded naturally without a dramatic ending. No grand finale. Just a soft return to quiet. Tyler opened his eyes. The sky was lighter now. Not bright yet, but changing. He straightened up, brushed his hands together, and took a step forward on the trail. The birds continued behind him, unconcerned with whether he stayed or went. As he walked, the question that had been following him didn't disappear completely, but it felt less heavy, less demanding, like it didn't need an answer right now. He didn't need to sing louder. He didn't need to wait for approval. He just needed to keep moving through his own morning at his own pace, and somehow that felt like enough for now. Tyler kept walking as the light slowly spread between the trees. The trail curved gently ahead, familiar, but never boring. He'd walked it hundreds of times in different weather, different moods, different versions of himself. It always looked slightly new anyway. The birds were still singing, though, not all at once anymore. One would call out then, another leaving small pockets of quiet in between. The pauses felt just as important as the sound itself. Nothing rushed to fill them. Tyler noticed how his steps had fallen into an easy rhythm. Not forced, not measured, just moving. His shoulders dropped a little more with each breath, as if his body was remembering something it had forgotten during the week. He thought about how often he'd treated his own life like a performance, even when no one was watching. How he'd edited himself internally, adjusting tone and pace, wondering how things looked from the outside. It was exhausting, living as if there were always an audience somewhere beyond the trees. The birds didn't live that way. They didn't ask if the forest approved of their song. They didn't replay it later, wondering if they could have done it better. They didn't compare themselves to the bird 3 branches over. They sang. And when they were done, they stopped. Tyler slowed and sat on a fallen log near the edge of the trail. The wood was cool and slightly damp solid beneath him. He rested his elbows on his knees and let his gaze soften, not focused on anything in particular. The forest continued its quiet work around him. There was something healing about realizing that his worth didn't have to be constantly reaffirmed, that he didn't need to earn the right to exist comfortably in his own life. He could just be here, breathing, listening, taking up space without apology. He hadn't always believed that. Growing up, praise had come with conditions. Do well, be useful, make sense to other people. Over time, he'd learned to translate attention into value silence, into doubt. If no one was responding, maybe he wasn't doing enough. Maybe he needed to try harder. But the forest offered no feedback like that. It didn't reward or withhold. It simply allowed everything to exist in its own way. Tall trees, small birds, quiet mornings, all of it counted. Tyler felt a small smile touch his face again. Not because he'd figured something out, but because he didn't feel the need to figure anything out anymore. The pressure to define himself softened the way fog lifts without being pushed. A bird landed on a nearby branch close enough for Tyler to hear the flutter of wings. It stayed for a moment, then lifted off again. No drama, no attachment, just motion. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sounds layer over one another, the birds, the wind, his own breathing. Each sound arrived, stayed, and moved on. None of them asked to be held. When he opened his eyes, the morning felt fully present now. Light had reached the forest floor. Colors had returned. Tyler stood brushing dirt from his hands and continued down the trail. As he walked, a thought surfaced, simple and unforced. Maybe I don't need to be seen to be real. It wasn't a declaration, just a quiet noticing. The birds kept singing behind him, not concerned with whether he remembered them later. They weren't building a case for their importance. They were living it moment by moment, without explanation. Tyler reached the point where the trail split. He paused, then chose the left path, the one that dipped slightly before rising again. He didn't analyze the choice. It just felt right. The forest held him as he moved forward. No spotlight, no applause, no judgment. Just the steady presence of something larger where every small voice had its place. By the time the trail opened up near the ranger station, the birds had quieted. The morning had moved on. Tyler felt ready to move with it. He didn't feel suddenly confident or transformed. He didn't feel certain about everything ahead. But he felt settled, like something inside him had found its natural pitch again. Not too loud, not too small, just true to itself. And that he realized was enough. By late afternoon, the porch was already half in shadow. Grace sat on the wooden swing with a thin cardigan pulled around her shoulders. Not because it was cold, but because the day had begun to let go of its warmth. The air carried that quiet feeling that comes just before evening, when nothing urgent is left to do, and the world doesn't expect much from you anymore. The swing moved slightly as she shifted her weight. Not enough to creak loudly, just a soft, familiar motion. Back and forth, back and forth. A rhythm she didn't think about until it was already happening. Across the yard stood the oak tree. It had been there longer than Grace had lived in the house, longer than her children had lived there, longer than most of the things that once felt important. Its trunk was thick and uneven, the bark rough and darkened with age. In the summer, it filled the yard with shade. In the winter, it stood bare and unremarkable, easy to overlook. Grace had noticed recently how people tended to overlook her too. It wasn't dramatic. No one was being cruel. It was quieter than that. Conversations moved around her instead of toward her. New ideas came from younger voices. Invitations arrived less often. When people spoke to her, it was with kindness, but also with a subtle assumption that her most active chapters were already behind her. She told herself it was fine. She had a good life, a steady routine, a job she'd done well for years. But sometimes, usually in moments like this, the thought would surface without warning. Do I still matter in the way I used to? The swing rocked again. Grace rested her hands in her lap and watched the oak tree's branches stretch outward, weight and heavy. Its leaves barely moved even when the breeze picked up. The tree didn't respond to the wind the way smaller trees did. It didn't rush. It didn't flutter. It stayed. She thought about how, when she was younger, she'd believed value came from visibility, from doing more, from being noticed, from having something to show. Back then she was all branches and leaves, busy spreading, reaching outward in every direction. Now much of that had slowed. Her days were quieter, more internal, less impressive from the outside. And part of her wondered if that meant something had been lost. The oak tree didn't seem to worry about that. It didn't try to look younger than it was. It didn't apologize for the thickness of its trunk or the heaviness of its limbs. It didn't chase attention with new growth every season. It simply stood there, rooted deep, holding the ground in a way that younger trees couldn't. Grace leaned back slightly, letting the swing support her weight. The wood pressed firmly against her spine, steady and real. She felt the tiredness in her body, not the sharp kind, but the deep layered kind that comes from years of showing up. The oak tree had rings. She knew that. Layers beneath the bark, each one marking a season of growth. Stress, weather, survival. None of them visible unless the tree was cut open. None of them obvious to someone passing by. And yet those unseen layers were the reason the tree could stand the way it did. Grace exhaled slowly. The thought settled somewhere inside her, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility. Maybe value didn't live in what people could see anymore. Maybe it had moved underground. She looked at her hands. The skin thinner than it used to be, veins more visible. These hands had held children books, grocery bags, grief, joy. They had done their work quietly, without needing to be admired. The swing rocked again, a little wider this time. The evening insects had started their low hum. Grace didn't turn on the porch light. She liked the half-light. It made everything softer, less defined. She thought about the younger version of herself, always reaching, always stretching toward the next thing. That version had been necessary, but it wasn't the only one that mattered. The oak tree had once been young too. Now its strength was not in how far it reached, but in how deeply it held. Grace sat with that image as the sky dimmed further. The yard grew still. The tree didn't move much at all, but somehow it felt more present than anything else around her. She didn't need to decide what this meant yet. She didn't need to turn it into a lesson or a reassurance. It was enough to notice the shift, to feel the weight of something steady beneath the surface. The swing slowed on its own. Grace led it. As the evening deepened, the air around the porch seemed to slow. The colors in the yard softened, edges blurring slightly, as if the day itself were getting ready to rest. Grace stayed where she was, letting the swing move less and less until it barely shifted at all. The oak tree remained in front of her, solid and patient. She realized she had never once worried about whether the tree was still useful. No one questioned its worth because it no longer grew quickly. No one expected it to prove anything. Its presence alone felt enough. More than enough. The shade it gave, the way it held the soil in place, the quiet sense of continuity, it all happened without asking for attention. Grace thought about how different that felt from the way people often treated themselves. How easily value became tied to output, to recognition, to how visible or impressive one appeared to be. And how, as those things naturally shifted with time, a quiet fear could slip in, whispering that something essential had been lost. The oak tree didn't seem to believe that story. Its roots were invisible, buried deep beneath the surface. They weren't admired. They weren't photographed. But they were doing the real work. Holding, nourishing, keeping the whole structure steady through storms that never made headlines. Grace placed her feet more firmly on the porch floor and let the swing come to a stop. The stillness felt kind, not empty. She noticed how her breathing had slowed, how her chest rose and fell without effort. Her body at least seemed to understand something before her thoughts did. She remembered a time years ago when she had been afraid of slowing down. Afraid that if she stopped pushing, she might disappear. That if she wasn't reaching outward, she wouldn't matter anymore. But sitting there now, she didn't feel like she was fading. She felt grounded. The oak tree had weathered seasons Grace could barely remember. Droughts, heavy rains, winters that stripped it bare. And still it stood. Not because it tried harder each year, but because it had learned how to hold itself from the inside. Grace rested her hands on the arms of the swing. The wood was smooth from years of use. Familiar, reliable. She thought about all the ways her own life had developed unseen strength through patience, through care, through simply staying when leaving would have been easier. Those things didn't show up on the surface, but they were there. The evening insects grew louder, then settled into a steady pattern. The world didn't rush her to come inside. It didn't demand reflection or resolution. It simply continued, allowing her to be part of it without effort. Grace's gaze drifted back to the oak tree one last time before the light faded completely. She didn't feel the need to compare herself to it. The image wasn't a lesson. It was a quiet companionship. A reminder that growth doesn't always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like depth. She stood slowly, joints stiff but cooperative, and reached for the porch light. When it came on, the yard changed again, smaller, more contained. The oak tree was still there, partially lit, partially in shadow. Unbothered by the change, Grace paused, hand still on the switch. She didn't feel the urge to hold on to the moment. She didn't feel like she might lose something if she moved on. What she had noticed would stay with her the way certain understandings do not, as thoughts to repeat, but as a steadier way of standing. Inside the house, the evening waited quietly. Grace stepped in and closed the door behind her. The oak tree remained outside, rooted and patient, doing what it had always done. Not reaching for the sky anymore, not needing to be seen from far away, just holding the ground. And somehow, that felt like the truest kind of strength there was. May's hands were already dusted with flour before the rest of the city fully woke up. The bakery lights were on, soft and yellow, cutting through the early dark. The room smelled warm even before anything went into the oven. Yeast, sugar, something alive in the air. May stood at the stainless steel counter, folding dough over itself again and again, pressing, turning, feeling the texture change under her palms. She'd done this thousands of times. The motion didn't require thought anymore. Her hands knew when the dough needed more pressure, when it needed to rest. The rhythm was steady, almost quieting. Still, her mind drifted the way it often did in the early hours when the world felt bigger than her small corner of it. Some days she felt invisible, not in a dramatic way, just small. One bakery on one street, one woman waking up before dawn to make bread most people would eat without thinking. Customers came and went. Compliments were polite. Life moved on. Occasionally, when she scrolled her phone during breaks, she saw stories of expansion. Bigger shops, louder success, people announcing milestones with confidence and certainty. And a familiar thought would slip in uninvited. What difference does one small life really make? May folded the dough again. The surface smoothed slightly under her hands. She sprinkled a little flour on the counter, watching the fine grains scatter and settle. Each one caught the light for just a second before becoming indistinguishable from the rest. She remembered a line she'd once read years ago. Something about seeing the universe in a grain of sand. At the time, it had sounded poetic, but distant, like a nice idea meant for someone else's life. Standing there now, she wondered what it had really meant. The dough resisted her slightly, then yielded. She paused, resting her palms flat, feeling the warmth begin to build beneath the surface. The transformation was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. Nothing dramatic happened, just slow change guided by time and care. May moved the dough aside and reached for another bowl. As she poured ingredients together, the sound was soft and dry. Flour against metal. Quiet. Unimpressive. And yet, this was how mornings began for her. Not with headlines or announcements, but with these small, repetitive acts that quietly fed people she would never fully know. She thought about how often she judged herself by scale, by how big something looked from the outside, by how many people noticed, by whether her efforts echoed beyond her immediate reach. It was easy to feel insignificant when measured that way. But the bakery didn't operate on scale. It operated on attention. If she rushed, the bread suffered. If she was careless, the texture changed. Each small choice mattered, even if no one ever traced it back to her hands. May leaned against the counter for a moment, stretching her fingers. Her joints ached slightly. A familiar, honest ache. Proof of effort, even if the effort didn't come with applause. She looked at the flowers still clinging to her skin, tiny white marks against warm brown. Each grain was almost nothing on its own, easy to wipe away, easy to overlook. But together they made the dough what it was. Without them, there was no bread. The thought landed gently, not as a lesson, but as a quiet recognition. She didn't need to be vast to be essential. She didn't need to be seen by everyone to be part of something whole. May returned to her work slower now, more present. She noticed the way the dough responded to her touch, the way patience made a difference. Outside, the city began to stir. A car passed. Somewhere nearby, a door opened and closed. Inside the bakery, time felt thicker, denser, like it was holding more than usual. She shaped the dough into loaves and placed them carefully on trays. Each one slightly different, each one complete in its own way. She slid the trays onto the rack and stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. For a moment, she stood still. She thought about how the world often taught people to look outward for proof of worth, to count impact in visible results, to believe that if something didn't scale, it didn't matter. But here she was in a quiet kitchen before dawn, surrounded by small things that would soon become nourishment. Not symbolic nourishment, real nourishment. Warm bread passed from hand to hand. The oven hummed softly as it heated. May rested her palm against the metal door, feeling the warmth through her skin. She closed her eyes for just a second. If the universe could exist inside something this small, she didn't need to be afraid of her size. She just needed to keep showing up. The oven clicked softly as it reached temperature, a small sound that meant things were moving forward. May didn't rush to load the trays. She let the dough rest a little longer, trusting the pause. In baking, waiting was part of the work. Not a delay, not a mistake. Just time doing what time does best. She washed her hands at the sink, watching the flour disappear down the drain. The water ran warm, steady. As she dried her hands, she noticed how quiet the bakery still was. No customers yet, no chatter, just the low hum of machines and the faint rhythm of her own breathing. There was a strange comfort in being alone with something simple. May leaned against the counter again, eyes moving slowly around the room. The shelves, the bowls stacked neatly, the apron hanging by the door. None of it was remarkable. None of it was meant to be. And yet it all belonged together, forming a small, complete world that made sense on its own terms. She thought again about scale, about how easily the mind learned to dismiss what was small. How often more was mistaken for better, bigger reach, bigger impact, bigger proof. It was a loud way of measuring a life, and not always a gentle one. The bakery didn't ask her to be loud. It asked her to be attentive. May opened the oven door. Warm air spilled into the room, wrapping around her face and arms. She slid the trays inside one by one, careful not to jostle them. The loaves sat quietly unassuming, as if unaware of what they were about to become. She closed the door and set the timer. The waiting began again. May poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the small table near the back. She didn't scroll her phone. She didn't fill the silence. She just sat there, letting the warmth of the cup seep into her hands. A thought passed through her mind, not sharp enough to interrupt the calm, but clear enough to notice maybe being small wasn't the same as being insignificant. Maybe small was simply a different way of being whole. She watched steam rise from the tea curl and disappear. Nothing about it tried to last longer than it needed to. Nothing about it tried to be more than it was. The timer rang softly. May stood, moved back to the oven, and opened the door. The smell of bread filled the bakery, rich and grounding. She pulled the trays out and set them on the cooling rack. The loaves were golden now, firm on the outside, still settling inside. They made quiet cracking sounds as they cooled, releasing heat. May smiled. Each loaf held countless grains of flour. Each grain had disappeared into something larger without losing its role. Not erased, not wasted, just included. She thought about how people often feared being swallowed by the whole, afraid of disappearing, afraid of not standing out. But maybe there was another way to belong, one that didn't require shrinking or shouting. The bread didn't need to announce itself. It didn't need to explain its worth. It would be broken, shared, eaten. It would do exactly what it was meant to do. May cleaned the counter slowly, methodically. The motions felt easier, now less burdened by comparison. She wasn't suddenly free of doubt. She knew it would return as doubts tend to do. But it didn't feel like the final word anymore. Outside, the street began to wake up. Footsteps passed. A car door closed. Someone laughed briefly, then moved on. The world was expanding into its day. May placed the loaves in the display case and adjusted the labels. She stepped back and looked at them, not with pride exactly, but with quiet acknowledgement. This mattered. Not because it was large, but because it was real. She wiped her hands on her apron and stood still for a moment longer. The universe didn't require her to be vast. It didn't require her to be everywhere. It only asked her to be here. And in that small, warm bakery, surrounded by ordinary things, she felt something settle into place. Not certainty, not accomplishment, just a sense of belonging that didn't depend on size, like a grain of sand, holding more than it seemed. Some evenings, Lily isn't sure whether she's tired from the drive itself or from staring too long through a fogged-up pane of glass. Not foggy enough to block everything, just foggy enough to make what's ahead feel unclear, uncertain, forcing her to squint a little more, tense a little more, as if trying harder will make the road appear. Lily is 47, an HR manager. That night, she's sitting in her car, parked in front of her house. The engine is off. The headlights are still on. A thin layer of fog coats the windshield. Streetlights bend through the haze, forming soft, scattered halos. Nothing dangerous, but not clear enough to feel reassuring either. She rests both hands on the steering wheel, not driving in right away. The day has been longer than she expected. A difficult meeting, a conversation that needed to happen but didn't quite finish. An email she wrote and deleted several times, unsure which tone was the right one. When everything finally ended, she found herself here sitting in the car, looking through the glass as if the road ahead were asking something more from her. Lily leans forward and wipes one corner of the windshield with her sleeve. The motion is quick, a bit forceful. The fog smears instead of disappearing. The wiped patch turns cloudy, warping the streetlights even more. She stops and notices she's just done what she often does in her own mind, trying to handle uncertainty with force. There are moments when if we can't see clearly, our first instinct is to break whatever's in the way. Push harder. Be decisive. But with a windshield that only makes things worse. Lily exhales very lightly. Her breath briefly adds more fog, then fades. She turns on the air fan at a low setting, letting the air circulate. Nothing changes right away. But slowly the fog begins to thin. She opens the car door. Cool air rushes in. Lily grabs a tissue from the glove compartment, folds it, and wipes the glass again, this time more slowly. No pressure, just enough to touch. The fog gives way to a small clear patch, just enough to see the white lane line ahead. Not the whole road, just a section. That small clear space calms her. Not because it solves everything, but because it reminds her of something simple. The problem isn't that the glass is broken. It's just fogged. And fog doesn't need to be shattered. It needs to be wiped. Lily looks through that clear patch. The familiar street. The familiar trees. Nothing new. But when fog settles on the glass, even familiar things can start to feel suspicious. In her mind, the thoughts from earlier that day feel the same. Not big problems, just too much condensation from stress, from trying to do things right, clinging to the surface she's looking through. She thinks back to the meeting, the feeling that she said enough, but still wondering if she should have said it differently. She's been hitting that thought all evening, replaying it, analyzing it, editing it in her head. And all it's done is make things murkier, like wiping glass with a damp sleeve. Lily sets the tissue down and sits quietly in the car. She doesn't do anything else, doesn't turn on music, doesn't rush inside. She just lets the fan run, letting the air do its job. The fog thins gradually, almost unnoticeable if you're not watching. The streetlights sharpen. Edges become clearer. A different feeling appears. Not relief, more like less strain. She realizes she doesn't need to see the entire road at once. She only needs to see enough to take the next step. And to do that, she doesn't need more force. She needs less. If you're listening and your life feels like you're looking through a fogged up windshield, not stuck, just unclear tonight, you don't need to break anything. Maybe you just need to wipe gently, with a breath, with a pause, with letting go of the urge to see everything right now. Lily looks through the windshield again. Not perfect. A few foggy edges remain, but the road is clear enough to drive. She starts the car and lets it roll forward slowly. No rushing, no speeding up, just moving. And maybe the mind works the same way. When you stop hitting the fog, the path shows itself one section at a time. Lily drives slowly along the familiar street. Not because she's afraid, but because there's no need to rush. The streetlights slide across the windshield, now less smeared, less distorted. The glass isn't perfectly clear. It's just clear enough that she doesn't have to squint anymore. And with that, something else inside her softens too, the urge to tense up and look harder. She arrives home, parks the car, and turns off the engine. In the quiet that follows, Lily stays seated for a few extra seconds, not to keep thinking, just to notice that the fog inside her has settled as well. Not gone completely, but thinner. She opens the car door. The night air is cool, carrying the scent of damp grass. Lily closes the door gently, as if she doesn't want to break the calm that's there. She steps inside, turns on the living room light at a low setting. Warm yellow light spreads over familiar furniture. Everything is still there. Nothing needs to be rearranged right now. Lily sets her bag down and takes off her jacket. Her movements are unhurried, no longer following the usual get things done sequence. She notices she doesn't need to replay the meeting. She doesn't need to rewrite the email in her head. Those thoughts may still pass by, but they're no longer stuck to the glass she's looking through. They hover at the edges, blurry and not demanding. She walks into the kitchen and pours a glass of water. Drinks slowly. The coolness moving down her throat is very real. A simple sensation pulls her back into her body, a place without fog, only the clear feeling of each sip, each swallow. Lily sits down on the sofa. She doesn't turn on the TV. She doesn't check her phone. Not out of discipline, but because there's no urge, she leans back and exhales. The breath leaves more fully than before. And in the space between breaths, a gentle realization appears. Not all uncertainty is a signal to act harder. She remembers wiping the windshield in the car. When her hand slowed down, when the pressure eased, the clear space appeared. The same is true for the mind. When she stops hitting her thoughts, stops scrubbing with analysis what needs to be seen, shows itself bit by bit. No forcing required. Lily stands, turns off the living room light, and walks toward the bedroom. The light fades behind her. In the bedroom, she draws the curtains, leaving a thin line of glow from the streetlight outside. The room is dark enough to rest, bright enough not to feel lost. When she lies down, Lily doesn't search for the perfect position. She lets her body choose. Her shoulders sink into the mattress. Her back is supported. Breath in, then out. With each exhale, it feels like gently wiping away a very thin layer of fog, not on the windshield, but on the way she sees things. A thought passes through. How will I say it tomorrow? It arrives, then pauses. It doesn't pull a chain of thoughts with it. Lily doesn't open the door for it. She doesn't slam the door shut either. She just lets it stand at the threshold and then leave on its own. If you're listening and you recognize the habit of wanting to break the glass, whenever things feel unclear, pushing yourself to be more decisive, think faster, fix more. Tonight you might try the opposite. Wipe gently, with a slower breath, by letting time do its part. Fog isn't the enemy. It's just warm air meeting a cold surface. Tension meeting fatigue. When conditions change, fog clears on its own. Nothing needs to be broken. Lily closes her eyes. The darkness softens. She doesn't need to see the entire road. She only needs to see enough to rest. And in that enough, her body knows what comes next. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's perfectly fine. You're not missing anything. The road doesn't disappear when your eyes close. It's still there in the morning when the glass is clearer. And if you're still awake, that's okay too. Just lie still a little longer. Let the breath keep gently wiping what remains foggy and allow the night to open in its own quiet way. Listen for a little while, and then let everything come into view just enough. Some nights, Grace feels like her room has grown smaller than usual. Not because there's more furniture, but because her mind has brought too many things in at once. Each thought feels like another chair being added, another box stacked until there's barely any space left to stand still and breathe. Grace is 62, a retired librarian. Her bedroom is quiet and orderly, everything in its proper place. But that night, standing in the middle of the room, she feels as if she's squeezed in among thoughts that haven't been set down yet. A phone call she hasn't returned, an old memory that showed up without warning. A vague worry about tomorrow, even though there are no real plans. She isn't panicking. She just feels crowded. She turns on the small lamp by the bed. The warm light spills onto the plain wall, making the space feel closer. Grace sits down in the chair and pulls open the top drawer of the nightstand. It doesn't stick, just makes a soft wooden sound, almost like a greeting. Inside are familiar things, a few old letters, her reading glasses, a small bottle of medicine, a worn hair tie. She isn't trying to clean in the usual sense. Her hands just want to touch something solid, something real. Grace takes each item out and places it on the tabletop slowly. The sound of objects touching wood is very gentle. The room doesn't change. But something inside her begins to shift. There's a letter folded into quarters. She opens it, reads a few familiar lines, then folds it back the same way. No digging, no analyzing, just letting it pass through. She sets the letter aside, not to throw it away, just to stop stacking it on top of everything else. A small space appears in the drawer, very small, but noticeable. Grace realizes the room isn't crowded because of too much stuff. It's crowded because everything is pressed too close together. There's no space between things. And her mind is the same way. The thoughts aren't too heavy, they just don't have room to breathe. She places the glasses back in the drawer, but not snug against the edge like before. She leaves a small gap beside them. Then the medicine bottle. Then the hair tie. Each item is set down with just enough space around it, not touching the others. The drawer looks lighter. Not because there's less in it, but because there's space between things. Grace pauses and looks at the open drawer. She doesn't see order in a perfect sense. She sees space. And in that moment, a very gentle realization lands. Quiet isn't the absence of thoughts. It's the space between them. She closes the drawer. The soft sound of wood again. The room is the same. But inside her, something has opened up. Not a big opening, just enough to take a deeper breath. Grace stands and walks a few slow steps around the room. No rush. She looks at the bed, the chair, the picture on the wall. Everything is familiar. Nothing is asking anything of her. And then she sees it clearly. The room was never too small. She had just been standing too close to her thoughts. She sits on the edge of the bed. The mattress sinks slightly. Grace rests her hands on her thighs and exhales. She doesn't try to make it longer. She just lets the breath finish its path. In the space between breaths, there's no question waiting for an answer. Just a thin, quiet sense of calm, real, even if it's light. If you're listening and you feel like the room inside your head is too crowded, too many thoughts packed too tightly tonight, you don't need to clear everything out. You only need to make a small gap between one thought and the next, between what's already happened and what hasn't arrived yet. Grace turns off the lamp. The room settles into softer light. The drawer is closed. Nothing has been thrown away. There's just more space for everything to sit without pressing against each other, and maybe that alone is enough for the night to begin to feel wider. Grace lies down slowly, as if she doesn't want to disturb the space she's just made wider. The mattress supports her back, familiar and gentle. She doesn't adjust the pillow again and again. She doesn't arrange herself into the right position. She lets her body find its own place, like the objects in the drawer earlier. Not too close, not too far apart. The light in the room is now just a faint glow slipping through the curtains from the street outside. Not bright enough to see clearly, but enough to keep the space from closing in. Grace realizes she likes this kind of light. It doesn't demand that everything be visible. It allows things to be seen just enough. She places one hand on her chest, the other on her belly. Not to control her breathing, just to feel the subtle movement as she inhales and exhales. Between the breaths, there's a brief pause. Grace rarely noticed that space before. It was too small to matter. But tonight it feels like a small side room opening up, no furniture, no tasks, just space. A thought drifts in. Not clear. Just a faint fragment of memory. Grace doesn't push it away. She doesn't hold on to it either. She lets it be there, then allows another thought to appear beside it without letting them touch. Between the two thoughts, there's a gap like the space between items in the drawer. And in that gap, there's no pressure. She realizes something: she doesn't need to be empty to feel at ease. She just needs not to be crowded. The mind can hold thoughts the way a room holds objects. The problem isn't how many there are, it's how closely they're packed. Grace gently turns onto her side. The blanket rustles softly. The space doesn't resist. It receives the movement the same way it receives another breath. She feels her neck and shoulders soften, not because anything has been resolved, but because she's no longer standing too close to what hasn't been resolved. If you're listening and your head feels crowded, thought following thought, with no place to rest tonight, you don't need to clear everything out. You only need to step back a little. Create some distance. Let each thought have its own place without stacking on top of the next. Grace exhales longer. Her shoulders sink into the mattress. Inside her, there's a quiet sense of spaciousness. Not joy, not relief. Just enough room to be still. She thinks of the library where she once worked. The shelves were never packed too tightly. There was always space to slide a book out without bumping into the next shelf. The reading rooms always had aisles. The space was designed so people wouldn't feel trapped. And she realizes the mind needs to be treated the same way. The light fades as Grace's eyes close, not because she's trying to sleep, just because her eyes are heavy. In the darkness, the space doesn't disappear. It's still there like a dark room. You know you're standing in, even when you can't see the walls. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's completely fine. You're not missing anything. The space doesn't close when your eyes do. It's still there waiting whenever you need it. And if you're still awake, that's okay too. Just stay still a little longer. Let each thought settle with enough space between it and the next, and allow the night to open a bit more. You don't need to empty the room. You only need room to breathe. Listen for a little while and let the space hold you. Marcus has always had a habit of wanting to see results just a little sooner. Not because he's impatient in an angry way. It's just that when you're used to routes with exact schedules, used to every stop having a clear destination, waiting without signals can make you restless. And that night, that restlessness showed up in something very small, boiling a pot of water. Marcus is 41, a delivery driver. After a late shift, he gets home when the city has already slowed down. The kitchen is quiet. The ceiling light is bright enough to see clearly, but not harsh. He sets a pot on the stove, turns on the gas, pours in the water. The water taps against the metal, then goes still. He puts the lid on like always. Just a few seconds later, Marcus lifts the lid again. The water isn't boiling. Of course it isn't. He sets the lid down, waits a moment, then lifts it again. A thin puff of steam escapes, fogging his glasses for an instant. He wipes them and exhales softly, not out of frustration, just a familiar reflex checking. He realizes he's still standing there watching the pot, as if it's responsible for something bigger. In his mind, a loop of thoughts is running at the same pace. How long until it's done? Should I be doing something else? If I don't pay attention, will I miss it? Marcus puts the lid back on. The metal settles with a soft, rounded sound. He steps back and leans against the counter. In the quiet kitchen, the sound of the gas burner becomes clearer, steady, unhurried. The pot keeps doing its job even without anyone watching. He thinks of something else in his life that's in a similar state. A decision that isn't ready. An answer that hasn't arrived. Something he wants to be finished sooner, even though he's not sure what finished would look like. And he realizes he's been lifting the lid on that situation just as often, thinking about it, checking on it, predicting outcomes, then feeling disappointed when nothing seems to have changed. Marcus steps closer and lifts the lid one more time. This time, a few small bubbles have formed at the bottom of the pot. Not boiling yet, but different. He smiles faintly and puts the lid back on. Maybe the water doesn't need him staring at it to heat up. It just needs time and heat, two things it already has. He pours himself a glass of cold water and takes a sip. The coolness pulls him out of the waiting rhythm. For a few seconds, he doesn't think about the pot at all. And when he's not thinking about it, something unexpected happens. He feels less tense. Some processes in life work the same way. When we keep lifting the lid, heat escapes. When we keep checking, energy leaks out. Not because checking is wrong, but because it happens too early too often and doesn't actually make the process move faster. Marcus stands there listening to the steady sound of the burner. The pot vibrates almost imperceptibly as the heat builds. He doesn't lift the lid again. Not out of discipline, just because there's no need. A small sense of trust settles in, the trust that some things, when left alone, will arrive in their own time. He hears the sound of the water beginning to change, no longer completely still. Something is moving beneath the surface. He doesn't look. He just listens. And in listening, he realizes he's relearning something very old that he hasn't used in a long time, waiting without tension. The water isn't fully boiling yet, but it's on its way. And this time, Marcus lets it finish the journey. Marcus stays still by the kitchen counter, no longer looking at the pot, not because he's forcing himself to turn away, but because the urge to check has softened. When his eyes leave the lid, his ears begin to notice more clearly. The steady hiss of the gas. The faint sound of metal expanding. A deeper, quieter tone, like a sign that something is happening beneath the surface. He realizes something unexpected. When he's not staring, time feels easier. Not faster, just less stretched. Marcus leans against the counter, folds his arms, then lets them drop. His shoulders loosen. His breath is no longer caught in his throat. A thought passes through. What if it boils over? It appears quickly, like an old reflex. But this time it doesn't lead to action. Marcus doesn't step forward. He doesn't lift the lid. He lets the thought sit there, and then watches it dissolve on its own, like steam meeting cool air. He looks around the kitchen. Everything is familiar. A dish towel hanging slightly crooked. The cup he just used, a few drops of water still clinging inside. The warm light softens the edges of the counter and cabinets. Nothing is rushing him. There's no countdown clock. Then he hears it. Not a rolling boil yet, just a clearer, steadier bubbling sound. A more confident movement from inside the pot. Marcus smiles faintly. He doesn't need to look to know. He can hear that the water is close. Some things in life work the same way. When you stop lifting the lid over and over, you begin to notice subtler signals. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic, just the quiet sense that the process is moving forward even when you're not watching. Marcus steps closer to the stove, but he doesn't open the lid. He rests his hand on the pot handle, feeling the heat through the metal. Hot enough. Clear enough. He turns off the burner and only then lifts the lid. Steam rises, clouds the air briefly, then fades. The water is boiling evenly, not overflowing, not rushed. He places a tea strainer in a mug and pours the water. The stream flows smoothly without splashing. Marcus carries the cup to the small table by the window and sits down. He doesn't do anything else. The first sip of tea is warm, spreading slowly. He exhales, feeling the heat enter his body in a gentle way. There's no sense of task completed, just the feeling of right timing. And that's very different from forcing an early finish. If you're listening and you have something in your life that's still heating up an answer, a change, a result tonight, you don't need to stand guard over it. You can let the heat do its work. Let time stay in the pot. Not every process needs constant supervision. Marcus stays there a while longer. He doesn't check his phone. He doesn't think about tomorrow. He just drinks the tea while it's warm. When the cup cools, he doesn't rush to get up. Some things are best when they're not hurried. He stands, tidies the kitchen lightly. No deep cleaning, no perfect arrangement. Just enough so the morning won't ask anything of him. Then he turns off the kitchen light, leaving the room wrapped in soft darkness. In the bedroom, Marcus lies down and pulls the blanket up to his shoulders. His body knows this rhythm, the rhythm of someone who has stopped standing watch. Breath in, then out. Not extended, not shortened, just steady. One last thought flickers, maybe I don't need to keep looking for things to happen. Then it fades. There's no need to hold on to it. If you fall asleep at some point while listening to this story, that's perfectly fine. You're not missing anything. The water boiled at its own time, and sleep does the same. And if you're still awake, that's okay too. Just lie still a little longer. Let the warmth inside you settle and allow the night to finish its own process. Tonight you don't need to lift the lid again. Just let everything come to a boil on its own. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.